is Jennifer Oneal. I'm a Math and Science Teacher Development Specialist here in HISD. Today, our HISD focus is going to be, I can partition concrete and pictorial area and region models to represent halves and to tell how many halves it takes to make a whole. Before we get started today, though, there are a few things that I want to make sure you have. I want to make sure that you have something to write with and something to write on. That can consist of a pencil, a pen, any marker, dry erase marker, or a combination of both. You can also have a piece of paper, a dry erase board, or a notebook, or a combination. Let's get started. Now let's begin some vocabulary practice for today. Our first word for today is going to be equal. Say the word after me, equal. Good job. Let's continue. Now, you're going to say, what does that look like in a picture form? I have 3 dots equal another 3 dots. What does that mean? What is the definition of equal? It means the same as. In this case, it means the same as another set of objects. Or it can also mean the same as a set of numbers. The same as. Our next vocabulary word, halves. Say the word after me, halves. Good job. Now you're going to say, what does that look like in picture form? I had a square and I partitioned it into halves. I drew the line down the middle to show 2 halves. Now, what is the definition of half? A whole that has been partitioned into equal parts. Our last vocabulary word is whole. Say it after me. Whole. Good job. Now, what does that look like in a picture form? I have a whole square. Whole. What does that mean in definition? A defined unit of 1. Let's review our vocabulary really quick. Our 3 vocabulary words are equal, halves, and whole. Equal, I drew the picture of 3 dots equal another 3 dots. It means the same as another number or another set of objects. Now we have halves. I drew a square and I drew a line down the center of the square to have 2 halves, 2 equal parts. A whole that has been partitioned into 2 equal parts. Whole, I drew a whole square. It is a defined unit of 1. Alrighty, let's review before we dive into our lesson for today. On our review, we're going to review when we partition a whole into halves and fourths, we need to make sure the parts are all equal. So we want to make sure that the parts are all the same, just like the vocabulary that we just reviewed and we looked at some of our pictures on our vocabulary. We want to make sure of that. So I already have some shapes here. I have some rectangles, I have a square, I have a circle, I have a triangle, and I even have a hexagon. So now we are going to partition our half, fourths, and then we're even going to discuss some things that don't have equal parts. All right, so now we're going to start with our halves. Let's partition this rectangle into 2 equal parts. So me drawing a line down the center is me partitioning this rectangle into equal parts. So I'm partitioning it into halves. Now, I want to take this hexagon and I want to partition this hexagon as well into halves. So now my hexagon is 2 halves. Those are 2 equal parts. It always goes back to that word equal. I want you guys to get used to using the word equal and partition. Those are going to be a lot of vocabulary words that we're going to use today. So now my rectangle and my hexagon right now have equal parts and they have halves. Let's move on to the fourths. I have another rectangle now. I want to partition that rectangle into fourths. All right, so I have 1, 2, 3, 4 equal parts now. So I partition it into fourths. Now I also have a square and I want to partition it into equal parts as well. So I drew my line down the middle, that was my half. Then I drew a line across, that's now partitioning into fourths. So now I have 4 equal parts. I have 4 equal parts here, and I also have 4 equal parts here. So now I have partitioned into fourths. Now, we have some things that don't have equal parts, because we also want to be able to identify things that are not equal. Let's say I draw a line here. Look at where I drew that line on that rectangle. Do you think that is equal parts? You're correct, it's not. It is not equal parts. This part here is not equal to the part here. So now, what if I do this with my circle? What if I try to draw this? What if I draw that line? Is that equal? No, this does not have the same part. What if I draw another line? So now is this part equal to this part? No, it's not equal. So now I do not have equal parts. Not equal parts. So I want you to pause the video and take a picture of this so you can see how it looks if we partition certain shapes into halves, fourths, and also now we've identified shapes that don't have equal parts. Let's get started on our word problem for today. I'm going to read it at least twice. The second time, I want you guys to think about what it is talking about and what it's asking us to do. Anna has a whole cookie to share with her best friend. How can Anna partition the cookie so each person gets the same amount? Let's read it again. The second time, I want you to pay attention and listen for some important information. And you can also jot some things down on a piece of paper that you were using earlier. Anna has a whole cookie to share with her best friend. How can Anna partition the cookie so each person gets the same amount? So now I drew a circle here. This circle is what we're going to use to represent the whole cookie. To represent that whole cookie, we want to name it. I want to name this 1. So I'm going to write 1 in the center. So now we know that this circle is represented by our one whole cookie. While we're also labeling, there are a few questions that we're going to answer and draw out today while we're trying to solve this problem. Our first question that I want you guys to think about is, how can we partition the cookie so that Anna can share it equally between herself and her best friend? The second question, how do we count the number of halves in one cookie? The third question, how many halves do we need to make a whole cookie? So we're going to be able to solve all three of those questions. So now, I'm going to take my dry erase and I'm going to actually draw this circle here, which represents 1 and represents one whole on my dry erase. So now it said, how can we partition the cookie so that Anna can share it equally between herself and her best friend? I'm going to use some dotted lines to draw down the center of my circle. So there's my dotted line down the center of my circle. So now I've partitioned my circle into 2 equal parts. How do we count the number of halves in one cookie? So now I want us to be able to label each part. And we're going to label each part as 1 half. This is another 1 half. So I drew the line down the center to partition my circle into equal parts. Now I've labeled it into 1 half and 1 half. We can count the number of halves in the cookie by saying 1 half, 2 halves. I can see that the 2 halves are the same as my 1 whole. So now I have my 1 whole here. I have my 1 whole here, and I partition my circle down the center. I have 1 half and 1 half. How do I read it? I say 1 half, 2 halves. How many halves do we need to make a whole cookie? We need 2 halves. So now I want to use a complete sentence to answer my question for today. I want to use Anna and her friend will each get 1 half of the cookie. We always want to finish with a complete sentence. So now we've answered all 3 of our questions. We have our pictorial model and we also answered it in a complete sentence. Let's continue some more practice on creating halves. Practice and partition our shapes into halves. Now let's read our word problem for today. James had a candy bar. He wanted to share his candy bar with his brother. How could James partition his candy bar so he can share the candy bar equally with his brother? I'm going to read it again for the second time. This time, I want you to take out your piece of paper that you had out earlier, and I want you to draw out what your thinking is on this problem. Maybe not try to solve it, but maybe draw it out on this problem. All right, I'm going to get started. James had a candy bar. He wanted to share his candy bar with his brother. How could James partition his candy bar so he could share the candy bar equally with his brother? So In my mind, I'm picturing a candy bar. I'm picturing our Hershey's candy bar. I love those rectangle Hershey candy bars. They're my favorite. So then I thought about it. I said, well, I'm going to draw it out as a rectangle on here. So now we can use this whole rectangle to represent the candy bar that James has. So now we want to name this candy bar. This candy bar is going to be named the number 1 because we have one whole rectangle. So I'm going to label it as 1. So James has a whole candy bar. And he also wants to be so friendly, and he wants to share it with his brother, but he wants to make sure his brother gets an equal amount, and he wants to make sure he gets an equal amount as well. So now we're saying, how is that going to happen? We're going to use these 3 questions to help guide our thinking. So let's read those 3 questions. How can we partition the candy bar so that James can share it equally between himself and his brother? Think about that question. Look at your paper. Look at your drawing that you have. If your drawing doesn't look very similar to mine, you can start over on another piece of paper or down farther on your paper and draw the rectangle and put a 1 in the middle because we know what that represents now. Our second question. How do we count the number of halves in one candy bar? Our third question. How many halves do we need to make a whole candy bar? So let's get started again. So we have our dry erase board here. And I'm just going to draw the same rectangle here that I have on my piece of paper. I'm going to draw that on my dry erase. So here is James' rectangle. Here's his candy bar. Remember, it did represent one whole. But now we want to answer the question, how can we partition the candy bar so that James can share it equally between himself and his brother? I'm going to use those same dotted lines that I used earlier. I'm going to start here in the center, and I'm going to use dotted lines to draw down the center of my rectangle. There's my dotted lines. So with me drawing my dotted lines, now that has given me an opportunity to have 2 parts. 2 equal parts. How do we count the number of halves in one candy bar? We count that by saying 1 half is another 1 half. Now, we want to be able to read this and want to be able to count it. So how do we do that properly? We're going to say 1 half, 2 halves. So then I want to say, how many halves do I have? That means I can see that we have 2 halves of the candy bar. And I know now that we have 1 half, 2 halves. How many halves do we need to make a whole candy bar? We need 1 half, 2 halves to make one whole candy bar. So I want to use a complete sentence to summarize what we did. James and his brother will each get 1 half of the candy bar. So let's review really quick what we did. So we started off with 1 whole candy bar. But James is so friendly, he wanted to share some with his brother. So then what did we do? We drew another candy bar and we used dotted lines to partition our candy bar into 2 equal parts. We label those equal parts as 1 half and 1 half. We count those equal parts as 1 half, 2 halves. Then we wanted to summarize it, and we said James and his brother will each get 1 half of the candy bar. time for you to practice on your own. You may want to pause the video or take a picture for use after the video ends. Today, we cover partitioning pictorial models to represent halves and tell how many halves it takes to make a whole. Your practice on your own for today is use a dotted line to partition each shape into halves and label each part. On your own piece of paper, I would like for you to draw a square, triangle, and a circle. I want you to use dotted lines to partition each shape into halves. And then I want you to actually label each part, as I did earlier in the video. If you need any assistance with the activity for today, I want you to reach out to your teacher. Thank you for tuning in to HISD TV.